My name is Naomi, 33 years old, and I recently watched my own flesh and blood bring the police to my $2.5 million penthouse to violently force me out into the street. They stood in my private marble hallway with my younger sister and her husband, completely convinced they had successfully stolen everything I had spent my entire adult life building. They smiled with greedy satisfaction, thinking they had finally put the quiet spinster sister in her proper place. What they did not comprehend was that my career as a forensic auditor meant I dismantle financial criminals and trace hidden assets for a living. They thought I was an easy target, but they had just handed me the legal hammer to destroy their lives. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe. If you have ever had to watch the people who were supposed to love and protect you try to tear you down out of sheer jealousy and greed, your support helps me share these stories of standing up to toxic family dynamics. The betrayal began on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday morning. The Chicago skyline outside my floor-to-ceiling windows was wrapped in a thick gray fog, casting a soft light across my custom mahogany dining table. I was working from home fully dressed in a tailored silk blazer, sitting in front of my laptop. I was actively leading a remote executive board meeting for one of the largest financial firms in the Midwest. As the lead forensic auditor, I was in the middle of presenting a highly sensitive confidential report regarding a multi-million-dollar corporate embezzlement case. My voice was steady and measured, projecting the absolute authority and precision required in my ruthless industry. I had just pulled up the final quarter financial projections on my screen when a jarring metallic screech echoed through my quiet apartment. It was not a polite knock. It was not the concierge ringing the doorbell. It was the distinct, aggressive, deafening sound of heavy industrial machinery biting into metal. Someone was using a high-powered drill directly on my solid oak front door. The 10 executives on my laptop screen immediately stopped talking. The chairman of the board furrowed his thick brow, asking if everything was all right on my end, clearly disturbed by the violent noise bleeding through my microphone. I muted my audio, my heart suddenly pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. In a highly secure luxury building with 24/7 security guards and private keycard only, elevator access heavy drilling at 10 in the morning was absolutely impossible unless it was a severe life-threatening emergency. I excused myself in the chat box with professional politeness, turned off my high-definition camera, and walked across the sprawling imported hardwood floors of my living room. The drilling grew louder and more aggressive with every step I took, sending a violent vibration that physically shook the expensive modern art hanging on my pristine white walls. I unlocked the heavy deadbolt from the inside and swung the thick oak door open, expecting to see a confused maintenance worker. The sight waiting for me in the private hallway felt like a bizarre, twisted hallucination. There was a strange man in a greasy work uniform holding a massive power drill, sweating as he pushed against my doorframe. Standing right behind him, arms crossed over his chest and looking incredibly smug, was my father Howard. Next to him stood my mother Diane, clutching her fake designer handbag and adjusting her posture to look as imposing as possible. Flanking them like a pair of triumphant vultures were my younger sister Ashley and her husband Kendrick. Kendrick is a 32-year-old African-American investment broker who always wore suits that were slightly too tight and far too flashy. Today was no exception. He was smirking broadly, whispering something into Ashley's ear that made her giggle like a schoolgirl winning a prize. But the most alarming part of this unsolicited, nightmarish family reunion was the presence of two uniformed city police officers standing just behind my parents. The officers looked incredibly tense, their hands resting cautiously near their heavy duty belts. Nobody said hello, nobody asked how I was doing. There was no trace of familial warmth or even basic human decency. My father did not even flinch or look surprised when I opened the door. His face was set in a hard, cruel scowl. He simply looked at the sweating locksmith, pointed a thick, demanding finger directly at my expensive brass door handle, and barked a harsh, unforgiving command. "Keep drilling right now," he ordered. "Change the deadbolt. We are taking this property back." I stood frozen in the doorway, staring into the cold eyes of the people who raised me as they actively orchestrated a hostile home invasion. Before I could even ask what on earth was happening, my father closed the distance between us. He did not hesitate. He thrust a thick, heavy stack of stapled legal documents directly into my chest, forcing me to grab them or let them scatter across the hallway floor. "Read it and weep." He spat, his voice echoing down the corridor for all my wealthy neighbors to hear. "The court has formally accepted our filing. We are suing you for elder financial abuse and defrauding the family estate." The words hung in the air, heavy and completely absurd. I glanced down at the front page. There it was, printed in bold black ink. A civil lawsuit filed against me by my own parents. He turned his attention to the two police officers, puffing out his chest with righteous indignation. "She stole our life savings," he declared loudly, making sure the officers absorbed every single word of his fabricated tragedy. "She drained our retirement accounts to buy this luxury apartment, while her mother and I struggled to pay for our basic groceries. We finally got a judge to listen to us." Right on cue, my mother began her performance. Diane clutched her faux leather handbag against her chest and let out a pathetic, trembling sob. She leaned heavily against the hallway wall, pulling a tissue from her pocket to dab at completely dry eyes. "We gave her everything," my mother wailed softly to the taller police officer, who suddenly looked extremely uncomfortable. "We trusted her to manage our finances. We thought she was investing our pension. Instead, she bought this penthouse and left us with nothing. It breaks my heart to see my own daughter turn into a monster." The officer awkwardly patted her shoulder, entirely fooled by the aging, frail mother routine she had perfected over decades of manipulating people. I looked back down at the papers in my hand. My mind, trained to dissect complex financial fraud and trace missing assets, immediately began analyzing the situation. The documents looked incredibly authentic. They had a court stamp, a docket number, and a signature from a local circuit judge. Attached to the lawsuit was an emergency ex parte order. In my line of work, I knew exactly what that meant. My father had hired a very shady, very aggressive lawyer to bypass the standard legal process. They had presented a mountain of fabricated evidence to a judge behind closed doors to get a temporary restraining order against me regarding my own property. I flipped to the third page and saw it. A forged power of attorney document. The signature at the bottom was a crude imitation of my handwriting, authorizing my father to manage my real estate assets. It was a blatant, highly illegal forgery, but it was enough to trick a busy judge into signing an emergency order. "You have exactly 2 hours to gather your personal clothing and leave my property," my father commanded, stepping so close I could smell the stale coffee on his breath. He tapped a specific page in the stack. The judge granted an emergency eviction based on financial exploitation. The order grants Ashley immediate and exclusive occupancy of this apartment until the trial concludes. So unless you want these nice officers to place you in handcuffs for violating a court order, I suggest you start packing right now. I shifted my gaze to my sister. Ashley was practically vibrating with excitement. She was not even looking at me anymore. She was peering over my shoulder, scanning my meticulously decorated living room. "Kendrick, look at those awful velvet dining chairs," she whined, pointing a manicured finger at my custom Italian furniture. "Those have to go immediately. We need to measure that wall for the new entertainment center before the delivery guys arrive tomorrow morning." Kendrick nodded enthusiastically, jingling a set of keys in his pocket. He looked at me with a sickening sneer. "Do not worry about a thing, Naomi. We will take good care of the place. You can leave the big television, though. I doubt it will fit in whatever cheap motel you end up in tonight." A hot wave of pure, unadulterated rage flared in my chest. My instinct was to scream, to tear the fake documents to shreds, to demand the police arrest them all for trespassing and fraud. But the logical, calculating part of my brain instantly took over. I looked at the police officers. They were here to enforce a judge's order, fake or not. If I fought them, if I caused a scene, I would be arrested for resisting, and my parents would have exactly the kind of unhinged mugshot they needed to prove their case. They wanted me to lose my mind. They wanted me to become the unstable, aggressive daughter they had just described to the cops. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the cold, hard logic of my profession settle over my anger like a heavy steel blanket. I looked at the older police officer, smoothing the front of my silk blazer. My voice was completely steady, devoid of the hysterical panic my parents were desperately hoping for. "Officer," I said clearly, "I will comply with the temporary order. I need exactly 15 minutes to pack my work equipment and some overnight clothes. I assume that is acceptable." The officer looked visibly relieved. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, nodding respectfully. "I appreciate your cooperation. I will stand by the door while you gather your things." My father scoffed, clearly disappointed that I was not putting up a fight. "Make sure she does not take any of the expensive artwork," he barked at the cop. "That belongs to the estate now." I did not even look at him. Instead, I turned my gaze to my sister and Kendrick. I let a slow, icy smile spread across my face. It was not a smile of defeat. It was the smile of a predator realizing the prey had just willingly locked itself inside the cage. Diane noticed it and shifted uncomfortably, pulling her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, but Howard and Kendrick were far too drunk on their fabricated victory to notice the absolute danger they were in. I walked past them, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, and entered my master bedroom. The younger officer stood by the doorway, giving me space but keeping me in his line of sight. I opened my walk-in closet, ignoring the rows of designer dresses and custom shoes. They were just things. I did not need them for what was coming next. I reached for my structured Hermes travel bag and packed 3 days' worth of tailored suits, basic toiletries, and a pair of flat leather loafers. More importantly, I walked over to my home office setup. I carefully unplugged my primary work laptop, slipping it into its protective sleeve. I grabbed my physical security keys, the encrypted backup drives, hidden in the false bottom of my desk drawer, and my passport. This was my artillery. As long as I had my data and my access credentials, they could have the physical walls of this apartment for the weekend. They were completely useless without the financial infrastructure that sustained them. When I walked back into the living room 15 minutes later, the locks had already been changed. The locksmith was packing up his tools. Kendrick had thrown his massive suitcase directly onto my white cashmere sofa, his dirty sneakers resting on the delicate fabric. Ashley was already taking a selfie in front of my floor-to-ceiling windows, her lips puckered for the camera, no doubt preparing to post about her amazing new luxury lifestyle on social media. "Here are the new keys, sir," the locksmith said, handing a gleaming pair of brass keys to my father. My father snatched them up, jingling them in his palm like a trophy. He looked at me, a cruel glint of triumph in his eyes. "Leave the building, Naomi," he ordered. "And do not try to come back. The concierge will have your photo at the desk with strict instructions to call the police if you trespass." I stopped right at the threshold of the front door. I looked at the four of them standing in my beautiful home, breathing my air, convinced they had outsmarted me. They thought my silence was submission. They thought my compliance was surrender. "Enjoy the penthouse," I said, my voice smooth and dangerously calm. "It is a beautiful space. But I should warn you, the automated smart heating system is tied directly to the floor sensors and the panoramic windows. It runs up a truly nasty electric bill if you do not know how to calibrate it." Kendrick let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Do not worry about the bills, sweetheart," he sneered, wrapping an arm around Ashley's waist. "We can afford it now that we do not have to pay rent. Just make sure you do not max out your credit cards paying for a motel tonight." My mother chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "We will pray for you, Naomi. We hope this teaches you a lesson about family loyalty." I looked directly into my mother's eyes, holding her gaze, until she was the one who had to look away. "Oh," I replied softly. "I have definitely learned a lesson today." I turned my back on them and walked down the private hallway toward the elevator. I pressed the call button, the polished metal cool against my finger. Behind me, I heard the heavy oak door slam shut, followed by the definitive click of the new deadbolt locking me out of my own home. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. I stepped inside and pressed the button for the lobby. As the door slid shut, cutting off the view of my front door, the cold smile returned to my face. They thought they had evicted me. What they did not realize was that they had just trapped themselves inside a $2.5 million piece of evidence. The descent to the ground floor took exactly 45 seconds. During that time, my mind shifted from defense to absolute scorched earth offense. I walked through the grand marble lobby, nodding politely to the concierge who looked confused to see me leaving with luggage in the middle of a workday. I pushed through the heavy glass revolving doors and stepped out into the crisp, damp Chicago air. I hailed a passing taxi, threw my bag into the back seat, and slid inside. The driver asked for a destination. I gave him the address of a high-end corporate hotel downtown, pulled my phone from my pocket, and opened my encrypted email client. The war had officially begun. The morning sun rose over the Chicago skyline, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare through the windows of my hotel suite. I had barely slept, but I was not tired. Adrenaline and pure calculating focus had completely replaced my need for rest. I showered, put on a fresh blazer, and headed down to the lobby cafe to start my day. I needed caffeine before I could begin drafting my legal counteroffensive. I ordered a black coffee and handed my primary platinum credit card to the barista. She swiped it, and the terminal immediately let out a harsh, flat rejection tone. The barista frowned, apologizing as she tried inserting the chip. Declined again. I handed her a second credit card from a completely different bank. The machine beeped its refusal a third time. I stepped aside, pulled out my phone, and opened my primary banking application. A stark red banner stretched across the top of my screen. Account frozen pending legal review. I quickly tapped through my portfolios. My checking account, my personal savings, and my standard brokerage accounts were all entirely locked down. The balance showed zero available funds. I walked over to a quiet leather chair in the corner of the lobby and sat down, my mind racing through the legal mechanics of what had just happened. My father and his sleazy lawyer had not stopped at the fraudulent eviction. They had filed a secondary emergency motion right as the courts opened, securing a temporary restraining order to freeze my liquid assets. To get a judge to approve that so quickly, they had to have presented the forged power of attorney, alongside fabricated bank transfer receipts, making it look like I was an active flight risk trying to move stolen family funds offshore. It was a classic, highly aggressive litigation tactic meant to starve the opponent into immediate submission. They wanted me destitute, panicked, unable to hire a good lawyer, and begging them for a settlement. Kendrick had probably advised them to do this, thinking he was a mastermind of financial warfare. They truly believed they had cut off my oxygen. Before I could even process the audacity of their next move, my phone vibrated in my hand. The caller ID displayed the direct line for the global head of human resources at my firm. I answered the call, keeping my voice perfectly level. Naomi. We have a massive problem, the HR director said, her voice tight with stress and deep discomfort. I asked her to explain. At exactly 6 in the morning, my mother had sent a sprawling, emotionally manipulative email to the entire executive board of my company, copying the HR department and several senior partners. Diane had played the ultimate victim card. She attached a heavily edited narrative claiming I had systematically drained their retirement accounts over the past 5 years, leveraging my specialized skills as a financial auditor to hide the stolen money. She begged my company to investigate me, claiming she and my father were facing imminent homelessness because of my insatiable greed and lavish lifestyle. The HR director sighed heavily into the phone. Naomi, you know how highly we value your work. You are our top forensic auditor. But company policy regarding financial integrity is absolute. Given the extreme severity of these allegations and your high-level access to sensitive client data, our legal team has mandated that we place you on immediate unpaid administrative leave pending a full internal investigation. Your corporate network access has already been revoked. I am so sorry. I told her I completely understood the protocol and promised to cooperate fully with the internal review. I ended the call and placed my phone face down on the small glass table in front of me. Let us review the scoreboard. Within 24 hours, my family had conspired to throw me out of my own home. They had successfully weaponized the legal system to freeze my bank accounts. and they had intentionally launched a malicious smear campaign that cost me my high-paying job and temporarily ruined my professional reputation. A normal person would have crumbled right there in the hotel lobby. A normal person would have broken down in tears, overwhelmed by the sheer suffocating weight of being utterly destroyed by the people who were supposed to love them. But I am not a normal person. I smiled a genuine, terrifying smile that did not reach my eyes. By escalating the situation to this extreme level, my family had made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed my personal checking account was my only source of wealth, completely ignorant of the highly secured offshore trusts I managed. And by getting me suspended from work, they had inadvertently handed me the one weapon I needed most right now. They had given me unlimited, uninterrupted free time. I opened my laptop connected to my encrypted mobile hotspot and bypassed my frozen personal accounts to access a secure, untraceable emergency fund. I paid for my hotel room for the next month in advance. Then I began to build the digital dossier that would completely dismantle their lives. I pulled up the exact court filing my father's lawyer had used to secure the temporary restraining order. It was a masterpiece of legal fiction. The lawyer, a bottom-feeding practitioner named Richard Vance, who specialized in aggressive civil litigation, had submitted an affidavit claiming I was actively liquidating my parents' retirement funds into untraceable offshore accounts. To back this up, he had attached printed ledgers showing massive wire transfers from my parents' joint checking account directly into mine. I stared at the digitized documents on my laptop screen, my eyes tracing the lines of fraudulent data. The ledgers were incredibly convincing. They had the right routing numbers, the correct bank logos, and even the subtle formatting quirks of their local credit union. But as a forensic auditor, I did not just look at the numbers. I looked at the metadata. I downloaded the PDF file containing the ledgers and ran it through a proprietary analysis tool I had helped develop for my firm. Within seconds, the software flagged multiple anomalies. The document had not been generated by a bank's automated system. It had been created using a commercial PDF editing software just 3 days ago. The IP address linked to the document's creation matched the public registry for Kendrick's newly formed investment brokerage. Kendrick. Of course. My brother-in-law had used his basic knowledge of finance to mock up fake bank statements, providing Richard Vance with the fabricated evidence needed to freeze my accounts. He actually thought he was clever. He thought he could outsmart a woman who spent her days dismantling international money laundering rings. I leaned back in the plush leather chair of the hotel lobby, steepling my fingers as I plotted my next move. The temporary restraining order was a nuisance, but it was just that. A temporary measure designed to create panic. They expected me to call them crying and begging for a compromise. They expected me to hire a desperate cheap lawyer who would immediately push for a settlement to unlock my funds. Instead, I opened a highly secure encrypted communication channel and composed a brief message to my personal wealth manager in Zurich. I instructed him to wire $50,000 from one of my diversified international trust accounts completely insulated from U.S. civil litigation directly to a newly established anonymous digital wallet. I would not starve, I would not panic, I would simply operate from the shadows. With my immediate financial needs secured, I turned my attention back to the battlefield my family had so eagerly prepared. They had struck first, utilizing the element of surprise and relying on the brute force of a corrupt legal maneuver. Now it was my turn to start dismantling their foundation piece by piece. My first target was not my father or my mother. It was Kendrick. He was the weak link, the arrogant opportunist who had married into my family with dreams of unearned wealth. He had provided the forged documents, which meant he was the most vulnerable to immediate legal pressure. I accessed the public records database for the state of Illinois and pulled the registration file for Kendrick's new LLC. He had named it Apex Wealth Management. I scanned the corporate filings, looking for the inevitable mistakes a sloppy, overconfident amateur would make. It did not take long to find them. Kendrick had registered the business using my penthouse address as its primary physical location. That was his first critical error. By claiming my apartment as his corporate headquarters, he was inadvertently linking his entire business operation to a property that was currently the subject of an active, highly volatile civil dispute. His second error was even more damning. In his haste to establish the LLC, he had listed my sister Ashley as the primary guarantor for a massive high-interest commercial loan he had taken out to furnish his supposed new office. The loan documents showed a forged signature that looked suspiciously like mine. He had not just stolen my home, he was actively attempting to steal my identity to fund his fraudulent enterprise. I smiled, the cold, calculating satisfaction washing over me. Kendrick had built his entire financial house of cards on a foundation of forgery and theft. All it would take was a gentle breeze of legal scrutiny to bring it all crashing down. I saved the documents to an encrypted flash drive, adding them to the growing arsenal I was preparing to unleash. The war had escalated, but my family was still fighting with wooden swords while I was arming a nuclear warhead. Just as I pulled the encrypted flash drive from my laptop, an automated calendar notification popped up on my screen with an aggressive red banner: Mandatory Compliance Review. The Human Resources Director had not just placed me on leave, she had initiated a full-scale internal audit of my professional conduct. I smoothed my blazer, took a sip of my cold coffee, and opened the digital meeting link. Waiting for me in the highly secure virtual conference room were 3 senior partners and an outside legal counsel hired specifically to investigate my mother's claims. They looked incredibly grim, their faces set in hard, judgmental lines. I immediately demanded to see the exact email my mother had sent. The outside counsel shared his screen displaying a sprawling multi-page document that Diane had maliciously blasted to over 50 high-level executives at my firm. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. She wrote about how she and my father had sacrificed their entire youth to put me through college, claiming they ate canned soup for years so I could afford expensive textbooks. She stated they had entrusted me with their entire life savings, over $600,000, to invest safely for their twilight years. Instead, she wrote, I had siphoned the money through a labyrinth of shell companies to purchase my luxury penthouse, leaving them facing imminent eviction and relying on local food banks to survive. She did not stop there. She attached fake medical bills claiming my father's blood pressure was reaching critical levels due to the stress I had caused. She begged the board not to let her sociopathic daughter continue managing money for innocent clients, warning them that I was a financial predator operating under their corporate banner. She even included a digitally altered photo of my father looking frail and exhausted, wearing a torn sweater I knew for a fact he only wore when painting the garage. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. My parents had never given me a single dime for college. I had clawed my way through my degree using academic scholarships and grueling part-time jobs while they paid for Ashley to take a gap year in Europe. But to a room full of corporate lawyers deeply terrified of a public relations nightmare, the email was a ticking time bomb. The lead investigator cleared his throat, adjusting his expensive glasses. Naomi. He began, his tone strictly professional, but laced with heavy underlying suspicion. These are severe allegations of elder abuse and financial fraud. Given your senior role here dealing with highly sensitive corporate accounts, we have to treat this as a potential massive liability. Your mother has explicitly threatened to go to the local media if we do not terminate your employment immediately and hand over your employee compensation files to her attorney. We cannot afford the optics of a senior auditor being investigated for defrauding her own elderly parents. The local news stations would have an absolute field day with a headline like that. I listened quietly, keeping my face entirely blank. I did not raise my voice. I did not launch into a passionate defense of my character or scream that my family was clinically insane. That is exactly what Diane wanted. She wanted me to look unstable, erratic, and highly defensive. Instead, I leaned into the camera and activated the exact same cold surgical persona I used when interrogating white-collar criminals. Gentlemen, I said smoothly, my voice barely above a whisper, but commanding absolute attention. I understand your position. However, as the lead forensic auditor of this firm, I expect you to apply the same rigorous evidentiary standards to this ridiculous email as you would to any corporate audit. First, look at the routing numbers listed in her attached documents. They belong to a regional credit union that does not even process wire transfers exceeding $10,000 without a physical signature in a branch office. Second, check the metadata on the PDF she attached. It was generated yesterday using a commercial software license registered to an unlicensed brokerage firm owned by my brother-in-law. The lawyers leaned closer to their screens, their expressions shifting rapidly from accusatory to intrigued. I continued driving the nail deeper. My mother claims I bought my penthouse with their stolen retirement funds. But if you check the public property registry, you will see my apartment is owned by a foreign registered trust, purchased a full year before the dates listed on her fabricated bank statements. The math simply does not align with reality. There was a long, heavy silence on the call. The outside counsel typed frantically, verifying the public records I had just cited. When he looked back up, the thick suspicion in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, professional respect. You have a very compelling counter-argument, Naomi, the HR director finally said, softening her tone considerably. But our hands are tied by strict corporate compliance protocol. Until the police or a civil court formally dismisses these allegations, we cannot risk having you actively managing client portfolios. You will remain on unpaid administrative leave until this family dispute is legally resolved. I nodded, feigning mild disappointment. Of course. I completely understand the firm's position. I will cooperate fully with any further inquiries. I ended the call and closed my laptop, a sharp, buzzing sense of satisfaction settling deep in my chest. They thought they were punishing me. My mother thought her little email campaign was a fatal blow to my career. She had no idea she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. By forcing my firm to place me on official leave, they were no longer monitoring my daily activities. I was completely free from corporate oversight, free from billable hour requirements, and free to dedicate every single waking moment to the absolute systematic destruction of the people who had tried to ruin me. They had just untethered a monster, and I was finally ready to go to war. I closed the conference interface and immediately opened a heavily encrypted terminal window on my screen. My fingers moved across the keyboard with rapid practice precision. I was no longer an employee bound by corporate policy. I was a sovereign entity operating entirely on my own terms. I typed a sequence of commands to establish a secure virtual private network routing my connection through servers in Iceland and Switzerland before bouncing it back to a localized data center in Chicago. I needed absolute digital anonymity for what I was about to do. While the encryption protocol finalized, I opened a separate encrypted folder buried deep in my hard drive. I clicked on a file simply labeled Genesis. The document that loaded on my screen was an old scanned credit report from exactly 11 years ago. I stared at the harsh black numbers printed on the digitized page. A $50,000 personal loan defaulted and sent to a predatory collection agency. I was 22 years old when I first saw that report. I had just graduated at the top of my class working double shifts at a local accounting firm, and I had applied for my very first apartment. The leasing agent had looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust, sliding the rejected application back across the desk. My credit score was completely decimated. I remember sitting in my beat-up sedan in the parking lot, calling the bank, and demanding to see the loan origination documents. The signature on the promissory note was a clumsy forgery of my name. It did not take a professional investigator to figure out who had done it. Ashley had spent her early 20s treating life like a limitless luxury vacation. She had maxed out 4 different credit cards on designer handbags, VIP club tables, and spontaneous trips to the Bahamas. When the debt collectors started threatening to garnish her meager wages, my parents panicked. But instead of forcing their golden child to take responsibility, Howard and Diane made a calculated decision to sacrifice me. They forged my signature, took out a massive high-interest loan in my name, and used the cash to quietly wipe Ashley's slate clean. When I confronted them in our family kitchen holding the fraudulent paperwork in my shaking hands, they did not apologize. My mother had simply sighed, telling me I was young and had plenty of time to rebuild my credit. My father told me family helps family, and that I was being deeply selfish for making a fuss over pieces of paper. They expected me to swallow the debt and stay quiet to protect my sister. They broke something fundamental inside me that day. They killed the naive, trusting daughter they had raised. But in her place, they inadvertently forged a weapon. I did not waste my time crying or screaming. I went back to school. I shifted my entire career trajectory. I devoured tax law, digital forensics, and white-collar criminal statutes. I learned exactly how money moves, how it is hidden, and how the people who steal it always leave a digital footprint. I became a forensic auditor specifically so I would never be a victim again. I spent a decade building an impenetrable fortress around my assets, waiting for the day my family would inevitably try to steal from me a second time. I closed the Genesis file, letting the cold, familiar anger sharpen my focus. That old loan was the reason I was sitting in this hotel lobby, fully prepared for their attack. The terminal window flashed green, signaling my connection was completely secure and untraceable. I began typing a long, complex string of IP addresses. I was not looking for public records anymore. I was going straight into the belly of the beast. I bypassed the standard commercial firewalls and triggered a dormant backdoor protocol I had personally coded into my penthouse network architecture. When I purchased the apartment, I did not just install a standard alarm system. I wired the entire property with enterprise-grade security infrastructure. Everything from the environmental controls to the hidden cameras in the ceiling fixtures was routed through a private localized server securely bolted inside a reinforced utility closet. My father thought he had locked me out by hiring a cheap locksmith to change a mechanical deadbolt. He had no idea that I still held the master digital keys to the entire physical environment. A black command prompt filled my screen, followed by a rapid cascade of green text as the hidden server authenticated my credentials. I was in. I now had complete undetected access to the internal network of my apartment. I could see everything. I could hear everything. And more importantly, I could record everything. I took a slow sip of my coffee and opened the live feed for the living room cameras. The high-definition video feed loaded onto my screen, instantly transforming my hotel room into an invisible observation deck overlooking my own living room. The visual clarity was absolute, capturing every corner of the expensive, sprawling space. But the audio feed was what truly mattered. The hidden microphones I had installed in the smart thermostats picked up every whisper, every clinking glass, every arrogant boast. I adjusted the volume, leaned closer to the monitor, and watched the enemy celebrate their stolen victory. My penthouse was completely unrecognizable. The pristine, minimalist aesthetic I had carefully curated over the years had been violently replaced by chaotic, performative wealth. Ashley and Kendrick were hosting a massive catered party. Over 30 people were crammed into my living room, spilling expensive red wine on my custom white cashmere rugs and leaving wet cocktail glasses directly on the polished mahogany surfaces. A private bartender was actively mixing drinks in my kitchen, using my rare imported crystal decanters. I watched Ashley glide through the crowd wearing a tight, deeply inappropriate sequined dress. She had a glass of champagne in one hand and her phone in the other, aggressively filming her surroundings for social media. "Welcome to the new crib, you guys," she practically yelled into her phone camera, panning the lens across the breathtaking view of the Chicago skyline. Hard work officially pays off. Kendrick and I just closed on this $2.5 million beauty today. God is so good. She paused. The recording took a large gulp of champagne and turned to a group of her equally superficial friends. "I cannot believe we finally got this place," she bragged loudly. "The previous owner completely trashed the energy in here. We had to literally force her out. She was this crazy, bitter spinster who was practically squatting. We had to get the courts involved and everything to protect our investment. But honestly, it is so worth it to finally have a space that matches our lifestyle." I felt a cold, sharp laugh catch in my throat. My sister was standing in my apartment wearing a dress she had likely purchased on a maxed-out credit card, lying to her friends about evicting a squatter, completely oblivious to the fact that she was currently starring in a high-definition surveillance recording that would soon be submitted as federal evidence. The camera angle shifted automatically, tracking the loudest source of noise in the room. The lens zoomed in on Kendrick. He was standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, separated from the main party by a heavy glass sliding door leading to the balcony. He looked incredibly tense, pacing back and forth with his phone pressed tightly to his ear. I isolated the audio channel for the balcony microphone and cranked the gain. "Listen to me, Marcus," Kendrick was saying, his voice a harsh, desperate whisper. "I told you the paperwork is done. The LLC is officially registered. The state recognized the application this morning." There was a pause as the person on the other end spoke. Kendrick dragged a hand nervously over his face. "No, they did not verify the physical address." Yet he hissed defensively. "That is the whole point. We have immediate physical possession of the property. If the compliance officers do a random drop-in, I will literally be sitting in the living room. It is a luxury high-rise downtown. It makes the firm look incredibly legitimate to the new investors." I began typing frantically, capturing the raw audio and video feed directly to my encrypted hard drive. Kendrick was not just throwing a party, he was actively conducting corporate fraud in real time. "Just push the offshore wires through the new accounts tonight," Kendrick commanded, his tone shifting from defensive to demanding. "Use the Apex Wealth Management letterhead. We need to show liquidity by Monday morning, or those seed investors are going to pull out, and I am not going back to selling used cars. Just do it, Marcus." Kendrick ended the call, looking out at the city lights for a long moment, before plastering a fake confident smile back on his face and sliding the glass door open to rejoin the party. I sat back in my chair, the sheer magnitude of his stupidity washing over me. Kendrick had not just forged documents to help my parents steal an apartment. He was actively using my property, a property owned by an international trust, to legitimize an unlicensed fraudulent brokerage firm and funnel illegal offshore investments. He was committing federal wire fraud, and he had just confessed to the entire scheme on a hot microphone in a room he did not legally own. My parents thought they were fighting a simple family dispute over real estate. They thought this was a civil matter about elder abuse and hurt feelings. They had absolutely no idea that their golden son-in-law had just escalated the situation from a local courtroom drama directly into the jurisdiction of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The trap was no longer just set. The jaws were already closing. I minimized the video feed, letting the raw audio continue to record directly onto my encrypted drive. The sheer volume of evidence Kendrick was freely providing was staggering, but I needed to build a comprehensive timeline. A single audio recording of a shady phone call might be dismissed by a highly paid defense attorney as out of context or circumstantial. But paired with hard, undeniable financial metadata, it would become an ironclad federal indictment. I opened a new blank document and began outlining the architecture of my counterattack. My first objective was to definitively link my father's attorney, Richard Vance, to the forged bank ledgers used to secure the temporary restraining order. I could not simply claim they were fake. I had to prove Richard knew they were fake when he submitted them to a judge. In the legal world, filing knowingly false documents to freeze an opponent's assets is called malicious prosecution, and it carries severe penalties, including immediate disbarment. I ran the metadata from the fraudulent PDF through a specialized tracking algorithm I used for corporate audits. The algorithm scrubbed the hidden digital signature embedded in the document's creation history. As expected, the PDF was generated using a commercial software license registered to Apex Wealth Management. But the algorithm revealed a second, far more incriminating detail. The document had been emailed from Kendrick's IP address directly to Richard Vance's secure law firm server a full 48 hours before the court filing. I pulled up the timestamp of the email and cross-referenced it with the official court docket. Richard had received the document, stripped the original metadata, and resaved it under a new file name before presenting it to the judge as an authentic bank record. He had not just been fooled by my family, He had actively participated in concealing the origin of the forged evidence. He was legally complicit in the fraud. I took a screenshot of the digital trail highlighting the IP address transfer and added it to a folder labeled Vance Disbarment. That was one enemy neutralized. Next, I turned my attention back to Kendrick and his fraudulent LLC. He had registered Apex Wealth Management using my penthouse address, which was a clear violation of state commercial zoning laws, but that was just a minor infraction. The real crime was the massive commercial loan he had secured using Ashley as a guarantor. I accessed a secure commercial credit database, utilizing my firm's high-level clearance credentials. I was technically suspended, but IT had not fully revoked my backdoor access to the external third-party servers we used for background checks. I pulled the complete credit history for my sister Ashley. The results were exactly as I had predicted. Ashley was currently drowning in over $90,000 of revolving credit card debt. She had missed 4 consecutive payments on her luxury SUV, and 2 separate collection agencies were actively pursuing her. Her credit score was practically non-existent. There was absolutely no logical way a legitimate commercial bank would approve her as a guarantor for a massive business loan. I dug deeper, analyzing the loan origination file Kendrick had submitted to the state registry. I found the approval signature from the lending institution. It was not a traditional bank. It was a high-risk predatory lending group known for turning a blind eye to bad credit in exchange for exorbitant interest rates and massive collateral requirements. I scanned the collateral listed on the loan document and felt my blood run completely cold. Kendrick had listed the $2.5 million penthouse as collateral for the business loan. He had used the forged power of attorney my father had created not just to evict me, but to fraudulently pledge my property to a shadow lender to secure funding for his fake brokerage firm. This was no longer just a civil dispute over temporary occupancy. Kendrick and my father had crossed a massive, unforgivable line. They had committed severe mortgage fraud, wire fraud, and identity theft. If they defaulted on that predatory loan, the lenders would immediately attempt to seize the penthouse, tangling my international trust in a nightmare of complex, drawn-out litigation. I felt a sharp, dangerous energy course through me. They had forced my hand. I could not just wait for the court hearing to dismantle their lies. I had to actively break their alliance and cause their internal structure to completely collapse before they caused any permanent damage to my financial portfolio. I needed to strike them where it would hurt the most. I needed to turn their greed against them and let their own paranoia tear their little criminal conspiracy apart. I closed the credit databases and opened an untraceable voice-over IP application on my laptop. It was time to start the psychological warfare. I dialed Kendrick's cell phone number, ensuring my caller ID was masked, and prepared to play the role of the desperate, defeated sister they all expected me to be. I cleared my throat, taking a moment to physically alter my posture in the quiet hotel room. Even though he could not see me, slumping my shoulders and constricting my chest helped modify my vocal cords. I needed to sound exactly like a woman who had just realized her entire life was over. I dialed his number using the untraceable voice over IP protocol. On the live high-definition video feed streaming on my laptop monitor, I watched Kendrick pause his nervous pacing on the balcony. He pulled his phone from his tailored suit pocket, frowned at the unknown caller identification, and answered. "Yeah, who is this?" Kendrick answered, his voice thick with annoyance and the background thumping of the living room bass. I let out a shaky, jagged breath right into the microphone. "Kendrick, it is me," I whispered, intentionally, making my voice tremble. I forced a slight wetness into my tone, mimicking the sound of someone trying to swallow down a heavy sob. "Please do not hang up on me. I just need 1 minute of your time." I watched his posture completely shift on the monitor. The annoyance on his face instantly melted into a massive, arrogant grin. He pressed the phone closer to his ear, waving off a party guest who had wandered too close to the glass door. "Well, well, well." Kendrick sneered, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "If it is not the high and mighty Naomi. What is wrong, sis? Did your fancy platinum credit cards finally bounce at the cheap motel?" "You guys won," I said, letting out a pathetic little sniffle that took real effort to fake. My accounts are frozen tight. My firm just suspended me this morning. I have absolutely nothing left. You and my parents took it all. I just want to surrender and be done with this nightmare. I watched him physically puff out his chest on the screen. He loved this. He absolutely thrived on the feeling of dominating a woman he had always secretly resented for being vastly more successful than him. That is just the real world, Naomi, he replied smoothly, adjusting his jacket. Actions have consequences. You stole from this family for years. We are just reclaiming what is rightfully ours. Now, what do you want? I am hosting a very important networking event in my new penthouse, and you are really killing my vibe. I lowered my voice to a desperate, urgent whisper. I do not care about the custom furniture. I do not care about the designer clothes in the closet. You can keep all of it. But there is a hidden wall safe in the master bedroom walk-in closet. It is concealed right behind the full-length mirror on the left wall. I watched Kendrick's eyes snap wide open. His entire body went rigid with sudden, intense interest. A hidden safe. The words hung in the air between us, practically glowing with the promise of undiscovered wealth. I continued piling on the calculated desperation. The combination is 421226. Inside, there is a small, heavy cedar box. Kendrick, please listen to me. There is no money in it. There is no expensive jewelry. It is just deeply personal, incredibly private, sentimental items. Things from my past I could not bear to lose. I need you to pack that box in a shipping envelope and send it to me. I pleaded, letting a genuine note of sheer panic seep into my voice. But you have to promise me you will not open it. Please, Kendrick. It would be incredibly humiliating for me if anyone saw what is inside that box. It has zero financial value, I swear to you on my life. Just please promise me you will not look inside the cedar box. The silence on the line lasted for exactly 3 seconds. I could practically hear the gears turning in his greedy, opportunistic brain. He was not thinking about my privacy or my humiliation. He was thinking about offshore account ledgers, loose uncut diamonds, or thick stacks of emergency cash. By explicitly telling a narcissist not to look at something hidden in a safe, I had guaranteed he would tear it open the second he had the chance. He was completely hooked. Look, Naomi, I am really busy right now, he said abruptly, his voice entirely devoid of the smugness from a minute ago. It was replaced by a frantic, buzzing urgency. I will see what I can do about your little box, but I make no promises. Do not call this number again. The line went dead. He hung up on me. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear, the pathetic, trembling demeanor instantly vanishing from my face. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk, and glued my eyes to the surveillance feed. Kendrick shoved his phone into his pocket and practically sprinted off the balcony. He shoved past my sister without a word, completely ignoring her confused shout. He pushed a caterer out of his way, his eyes wild with the delusion of finding my secret fortune, and marched directly down the hallway toward the master suite. He was walking straight into the trap. The psychological game had officially begun, and my greedy brother-in-law had just eagerly taken the very first pawn. I watched the live video feed as Kendrick practically kicked the master bedroom door shut behind him. He reached over and turned the heavy brass lock, ensuring none of the party guests or my sister could interrupt his little treasure hunt. He marched straight over to the left wall of the massive walk-in closet. He did not even bother to turn on the overhead lights, relying only on the ambient glow from the city skyline filtering through the bedroom windows. The hidden microphone in the ceiling picked up his heavy, excited breathing. He grabbed the edge of the heavy floor-to-ceiling mirror and shoved it to the side. The hidden digital keypad illuminated the dark space with a harsh blue glow. I saw his fingers trembling slightly with anticipation as he punched in the numbers I had given him. 42-12-26. The heavy steel door let out a solid mechanical click and swung open. Kendrick reached inside, eagerly pulling out the small, heavy cedar box I had mentioned. He carried it over to my king-sized bed and sat down, treating the wooden container like it held the Holy Grail. He did not hesitate for a single second. He completely ignored the promise he had just made to me on the phone. He flipped the brass latch and threw the lid open. I could see the exact moment his greedy anticipation shattered into absolute confusion. There were no stacks of $100 bills bound in rubber bands. There were no velvet pouches filled with diamonds or keys to offshore safety deposit boxes. There was only a single standard manila envelope resting at the bottom of the cedar box. Across the front of the envelope, his own name was written in bold black marker. Kendrick stared at his name for a long moment. I could see the gears shifting in his head, a sudden wave of paranoia washing over his features. He swallowed hard, the microphone picking up the dry sound in his throat. He tore the envelope open and pulled out a thick stack of printed financial documents. I knew exactly what he was looking at, because I had printed them myself 3 months ago during a routine background check. It was a complete certified copy of the auto loan origination file for Ashley's $80,000 luxury Porsche Macan. For years, Ashley had bragged to the entire family that she had bought the vehicle outright, using profits from her highly successful life coaching business. My parents had constantly praised her financial independence, using her fake success to belittle me. Kendrick had driven the car proudly, completely oblivious to the reality of his wife's actual financial situation. He flipped to the second page of the document. The camera captured his eyes widening in pure horror. The primary borrower on the predatory 24% interest loan was not Ashley, it was Kendrick. She had used his full legal name, his date of birth, and his social security number to secure the financing. And on the bottom line, where the borrower was required to sign, was a blatant, sloppy forgery of his signature. I watched his chest begin to heave as he rapidly flipped through the remaining pages. He found the payment history ledger attached to the back. Ashley was currently 4 months behind on the payments. The vehicle was actively scheduled for repossession by the end of the week, and the defaulted loan had completely tanked his personal credit score. The very same credit score he desperately needed to keep his own fraudulent commercial loan afloat. His entire financial foundation was built on a sinkhole his own wife had dug for him. Kendrick dropped the papers onto the bed like they were burning his hands. He ran both hands over his head, pacing frantically at the foot of the bed. He was suddenly connecting all the dots. He realized his beautiful, successful wife was a total fraud who had actively committed identity theft against him. He realized his own financial future was suddenly in catastrophic jeopardy. And worst of all, he realized that I had known about it all along. I had not hidden this document to protect my own privacy. I had hidden it as a dormant landmine, waiting for the exact right moment to detonate it. By telling him not to look, I had guaranteed he would uncover his wife's betrayal in the middle of a crowded party, trapped in an apartment he had illegally seized. He had thought he was a mastermind playing a rigged game against a weak opponent. Now he realized he was just another pawn on my board. He grabbed the papers, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He did not carefully put the mirror back in place or close the wall safe. He marched out of the closet, threw the bedroom door open, and stormed down the hallway toward the loud music of the living room. The fragile alliance between my toxic sister and her greedy husband had officially been fractured. The poison was in the water, and I sat back in my hotel chair, taking a slow sip of my coffee, as I prepared to watch them tear each other apart. I watched Kendrick march down the hallway, the crumpled loan documents gripped tightly in his fist. He was practically vibrating with rage, ready to confront Ashley in front of her entire fake social circle. But before he could even reach the living room to tear her world apart, I decided it was time to deploy my second countermeasure. I typed a brief command into my laptop terminal and hit enter. Instantly, the high-definition video feed on my screen plunged into absolute darkness. I switched the camera feed to infrared mode, watching the screen shift into a glowing, ghostly green. Inside the penthouse, the loud, thumping bass of the party music abruptly cut off. The smart lighting system completely shut down. The massive centralized climate control unit hummed to a grinding halt. The sudden silence in the apartment was deafening, followed immediately by the confused, angry murmurs of 30 party guests suddenly standing in pitch blackness. But I did not stop at the electricity. With another keystroke, I accessed the apartment plumbing manifold. I electronically closed the main water valve, On the audio feed, I heard the bartender curse loudly from the kitchen, complaining that the sink had just run completely dry. Someone else shouted from the guest bathroom that the toilet would not flush. The luxurious $2.5 million penthouse had just been instantly transformed into a dark, suffocating concrete box. I watched my father push his way through the confused crowd of guests. Howard always needed to feel like the ultimate patriarch, the man in absolute control of every situation. He pulled out his phone, the screen illuminating his angry, scowling face in the dark, and dialed the luxury building management office. I boosted the audio gain on the living room microphone to catch every single word of the conversation. "This is Howard," he barked into the phone, his voice dripping with unearned authority. "I am the new legal resident of Penthouse 4. The power and water just shut off in the middle of a very important networking event. I demand you send maintenance up here to fix this immediately, or I will be deducting this massive inconvenience from our next monthly fee." The night manager, a sharp, no-nonsense professional named Mr. Harrison, did not even flinch at my father and his aggressive tone. His response came through the phone speaker crisp and entirely unbothered. "Sir, the utilities were shut off remotely by the automated system because the association fees for that unit are severely delinquent. The outstanding balance is exactly $5,000. Services will not be restored until the account is brought current by the legal owner." My father let out a harsh, dismissive laugh, clearly offended by the pushback. "That is not my problem," he snapped loudly, making sure the guests could hear him taking charge. "You need to bill the previous owner, Naomi. She was managing the finances before we evicted her today. I have a court order granting my family immediate occupancy. Now turn the lights back on before I call my lawyer and sue this building for harassment." There was a brief, heavy pause on the line before Mr. Harrison dropped the absolute bombshell. "Sir, I am looking at the legal deed for Penthouse 4 right now. Naomi is not the owner of that property. She never has been. The unit is owned entirely by an international corporate entity called Titan Trust, LLC. We have absolutely no record of you, your daughter Ashley, or anyone else in your family on the approved occupancy registry." Howard froze. In the infrared camera feed, I saw his posture completely stiffen. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice suddenly losing all of its arrogant bluster. "I have a signed power of attorney right here." "A power of attorney for Naomi is completely irrelevant," Mr. Harrison replied coldly. "She does not own the asset. The corporate trustee of Titan Trust contacted us earlier this evening to report an illegal break-in. Since you just admitted to occupying a corporate-owned property without a valid lease or authorization from the trust board, you are technically classified as squatters. If you and your guests do not vacate the premises immediately, my security team will be escorting the police upstairs to arrest you all for felony trespassing." The line went dead. Howard slowly lowered the phone, his face pale and slack in the glowing green light of the infrared camera. The party guests, having overheard the entire humiliating exchange in the quiet, dark room, began grabbing their coats and heading straight for the door. Nobody wanted to be caught in a police raid. Within 5 minutes, the massive apartment was completely empty of outsiders. Kendrick, Ashley, Diane, and Howard were left standing alone in the pitch-black, freezing-cold living room, completely stripped of their delusions. The absolute reality of their situation was finally starting to set in. The next morning, the Chicago skyline was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The crisp air felt completely detached from the absolute chaos I had unleashed the night before. I left my hotel room wearing a sharp, tailored black suit and my most intimidating leather heels. I carried a single item, a thick, unmarked leather binder containing exactly 50 pages of devastating financial truth. I was not going to the courthouse. I was going straight for the architect of my family's legal offensive. Richard Vance operated out of a high-end boutique law firm in the financial district. The office was designed to project wealth and invulnerability, with expensive modern art lining the walls and a receptionist sitting behind a massive slab of imported marble. I bypassed the receptionist, completely ignoring her protests as she demanded I stop. I knew exactly which corner office belonged to Richard. I pushed the heavy glass door open and stepped inside without knocking. Richard looked up from his mahogany desk, his expression instantly twisting into a mask of aggressive indignation. He was a man in his late 50s wearing a suit that cost more than most cars with a face that looked permanently flushed from expensive scotch. "Excuse me." He snapped his hand, hovering over the intercom button to call security. "You cannot just barge in here. Who the hell are you?" "I am Naomi," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "I am the woman whose bank accounts you illegally froze yesterday using forged documents." Richard froze for a fraction of a second before quickly recovering his arrogant posture. "Ah, the ungrateful daughter," he sneered, leaning back in his leather chair. "You have a lot of nerve showing up here. The temporary restraining order is legally binding. If you are here to cry and beg for a settlement, you are wasting your time. You can speak to me in court. Get out of my office before I have you arrested for trespassing." I did not blink. I did not raise my voice. I simply walked forward, the heels of my shoes clicking sharply against the hardwood floor, and dropped the heavy leather binder directly onto the center of his pristine desk. The sound echoed in the quiet room like a gunshot. "I am not here to negotiate a settlement, Richard," I said smoothly. "I am here to discuss your early retirement." He looked down at the binder, a faint flicker of genuine unease passing behind his eyes. He slowly reached out and flipped it open. I watched his face as his eyes scanned the first page. It was a complete, highly detailed organizational chart of a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. A company he secretly controlled. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice suddenly losing its booming confidence. "That is a forensic audit of your personal finances over the last 4 years, I explained calmly, leaning slightly over his desk to ensure he heard every single word. "I am a senior forensic auditor, Richard. When you attacked me, I decided to return the favor. Turn to page 12. He hesitated, then slowly turned the pages. His face drained of color entirely. Page 12 detailed a series of massive, untraceable wire transfers from a local real estate developer directly into his offshore account. Those transfers correspond exactly with the dates you successfully lobbied the city zoning board to reclassify the waterfront properties, I said, my voice sharp and precise. It is a textbook bribery scheme. Turn to page 34. That section details your aggressive tax evasion strategy, specifically how you have been underreporting your firm's revenue by funneling client retainers through a secondary unregistered LLC. Richard was breathing heavily now, his eyes darting frantically across the pages. He looked like a man who had just realized he was standing on a landmine that had already clicked. "This is illegally obtained information," he stammered, his voice tight with panic. "You hacked my servers. This is inadmissible in court." I smiled, a cold, empty expression. "I did not hack anything, Richard. All of this information is available through public international registries and standard financial compliance databases if you know exactly where to look. And even if it was inadmissible in a civil suit, the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation will not care how I found it. They will only care that it is absolutely true." I checked the thin gold watch on my wrist. "I am going to give you exactly 10 minutes, I said, stepping back from his desk. "You have 10 minutes to draft a formal letter of withdrawal from my parents' case. You will state that you are withdrawing due to an irreconcilable conflict of interest, and you will email it directly to the presiding judge and copy me. If you do this, I walk out of this office and leave that binder on your desk. And if I refuse?" Richard whispered, his arrogance completely shattered. "If you refuse," I replied, my tone dropping to a dangerous hush, "I will walk out of this building, get in a cab, and hand-deliver a copy of that binder to the State Bar Association, the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, and the local federal prosecutor. You will not just lose your license to practice law. You will spend the next 10 years in federal prison." Richard looked from the binder to my face. He saw absolutely no hesitation, no bluffing, and no mercy. His hands were shaking as he reached for his keyboard. He did not say another word to me. He opened his email client and began typing furiously. He was a survivor, and he knew exactly when he had been completely outplayed. Exactly 7 minutes later, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw the email notification. Richard had officially withdrawn as the legal counsel for Howard and Diane. The temporary restraining order on my accounts would be voided within hours due to lack of representation, and my parents were now completely defenseless heading into the mediation hearing. I picked up the leather binder, turned my back on the ruined lawyer, and walked out of the office. The enemy's sword was broken. Now it was time to watch them turn on each other. I stepped out of the heavy glass doors of the law firm and took a deep, refreshing breath of the crisp Chicago air. The morning traffic roared past me, completely oblivious to the absolute destruction I had just orchestrated upstairs. My phone buzzed in my hand. It was an automated notification from my banking application. The aggressive temporary restraining order that had frozen my personal accounts was officially pending dismissal due to a sudden lack of legal representation from the plaintiff. My liquid cash would be fully accessible within 24 hours. I smiled, flagged down a passing taxi, and gave the driver the address to my hotel. I needed to get back to my screens. I did not want to miss a single second of my father realizing he was completely defenseless. When I arrived at my suite, I threw my blazer onto the bed, poured a fresh cup of coffee, and immediately woke up my laptop. The live video feed from my penthouse loaded instantly. The morning sun was pouring through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the absolute wreckage of the previous night. Half-empty wine glasses stained my custom rugs, and crushed appetizers were ground into the hardwood. But I did not care about the mess. I cared about the 4 miserable figures shivering in the center of my living room. Because the building management had remotely disabled the utilities, the apartment had zero central heating. In the middle of a damp Chicago autumn, a glass-walled penthouse quickly turns into a very expensive icebox. My mother was huddled in the corner of the sofa, wrapped tightly in one of my imported wool throw blankets, her face pale and devoid of her usual arrogant makeup. Ashley looked like a complete disaster, her sequined party dress wrinkled and her hair tangled. Kendrick was pacing near the dark kitchen, his arms crossed tightly against his chest, refusing to look at his wife. My father was sitting stiffly in a leather armchair, frantically tapping the screen of his phone. He was desperately trying to find a plumber or an electrician who would bypass the building management to turn the power back on. But at exactly 9:30, an email notification chimed loudly in the quiet, freezing room. Howard eagerly opened the message, probably hoping it was the building manager apologizing and restoring the utilities. Instead, I watched through the high-definition camera as the last remaining shreds of his false confidence completely evaporated. His mouth fell open slightly. His eyes darted back and forth across the screen, reading the short, brutal withdrawal letter Richard had just submitted to the court. "What is it?" Diane asked, her voice trembling from the cold and the thick tension in the room. "Howard, what did they say?" My father swallowed hard, his throat working visibly. "Richard just dropped us," he whispered, the absolute panic finally bleeding into his arrogant voice. "He filed an emergency withdrawal with the court this morning. He says there is an immediate and irreconcilable conflict of interest, and he is legally severing all ties with us as his clients." The room erupted. Diane let out a sharp, terrified gasp. Ashley sat up straight, the blanket falling off her shoulders. But Kendrick was the one who completely exploded. He marched across the living room, his face twisted in absolute fury, and snatched the phone directly out of my father's hand. "Are you completely insane?" Kendrick yelled, reading the screen for himself. "We have a mandatory mediation hearing in 2 days. He is the one holding all the fabricated bank ledgers. He is the one who filed the injunctions against her. If he walks away now, we have absolutely no legal shield when we walk into that courtroom." "Call him right now," my father ordered, trying desperately to regain his patriarchal authority. "Tell him I will double his retainer. He cannot just abandon a civil case right before a judge reviews it." Kendrick hit the dial button and put the phone on speaker. The dial tone echoed in the silent apartment, followed immediately by the automated voice of a generic voicemail box. Richard had not just dropped them as clients, he had actively blocked their numbers. "He is gone," Howard Kendrick sneered, dropping the phone onto the glass coffee table with a harsh clatter. "Your high-priced bulldog took one look at something and ran for the hills. He knows we are going down." I leaned back in my hotel chair, taking a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my coffee. Kendrick was exactly right. My father had relied entirely on Richard's aggressive reputation to bully the court system. Without him, Howard was just an angry, foolish old man holding a stack of clumsily forged documents. They had no time to find another high-profile attorney willing to take a complex financial case on 2 days' notice, especially not one abandoned by someone like Richard. Their only option now was to scramble for a cheap, desperate strip mall lawyer to represent them or face the judge entirely alone. The walls were rapidly closing in, and the true panic had finally taken root. I watched the infrared feed as Kendrick stood over the glass coffee table, his chest heaving. The panic over Richard withdrawing as their lawyer hung heavy in the freezing room. But Kendrick was not finished. The realization that they were legally defenseless seemed to snap the last remaining thread of his patience. He turned his attention away from my father and locked his eyes directly on Ashley. He raised his right hand, tightly gripping the crumpled manila envelope he had pulled from my hidden safe. "You want to talk about going down, Howard?" Kendrick shouted, his voice echoing sharply against the high ceilings. "Let us talk about your perfect, successful daughter. Let us talk about how my own wife just destroyed my entire life." He violently threw the stack of papers directly at Ashley. The pages scattered across the dark living room, fluttering down onto the expensive rugs. Ashley flinched, pulling the wool blanket tighter around her shoulders. "What are you doing?" she whined, her voice taking on that familiar high-pitched tone of a cornered child. Kendrick stepped closer to her, his shadow looming large in the infrared glow. "I found the auto loan documents in the safe, Ashley." He spat, his voice trembling with pure rage. "I found the original financing paperwork for your stupid Porsche. You did not buy that car with your life coaching money. You have zero money. You are drowning in credit card debt. You used my social security number and forged my signature to take out an $80,000 predatory loan at 24% interest." Diane gasped loudly, rushing to sit next to Ashley on the sofa. Howard stood up, puffing out his chest. "Now hold on a minute," my father ordered, pointing a finger at Kendrick. "Watch your tone when you speak to my daughter." "Watch my tone." Kendrick laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that held zero humor. "She committed identity theft against her own husband. The car is 4 months behind on payments. It is scheduled for repossession this week. My personal credit score is completely ruined because of her. Do you understand what that means, Howard? The commercial loan I just took out to fund my brokerage firm is going to default the second they do a routine credit sweep. I am going to lose everything." Ashley burst into loud, theatrical tears. She buried her face in my mother's shoulder. "I did not mean to," she sobbed loudly. "I just needed a reliable car for my brand image. I was going to pay it back as soon as my business took off." "Kendrick was not supporting my dreams, Mom. He never gives me enough money." That was all the justification my parents needed. They had spent 30 years protecting Ashley from the consequences of her own actions, and they were not going to stop now. Diane glared at Kendrick, her eyes narrowed in the darkness. "You should be ashamed of yourself," Kendrick, my mother hissed. "A real man provides for his wife. He does not scream at her over a simple financial misunderstanding. She is under a lot of stress right now." "A misunderstanding," Kendrick yelled, stepping back as if he had been physically struck. "It is a federal crime." Howard stepped directly into Kendrick's personal space, his face twisted in an ugly, arrogant scowl. "You listen to me, boy," my father growled, the underlying bigotry finally bleeding to the surface. "We welcomed you into this family. We gave you a chance when nobody else would. You came from absolutely nothing, hustling on the streets, trying to play the big-shot investment banker. You should be down on your knees thanking God that a woman with Ashley's pedigree even looked twice at you." Diane chimed in, her voice dripping with venomous classism. "We always knew what you really were, Kendrick. You talk a big game, but you are just a cheap scam artist wearing a tight suit. You people always try to drag us down to your level. We let you marry her because we thought you could at least pay the bills, but clearly we were wrong." I watched the infrared camera as Kendrick froze. The racist, classist microaggressions hit him like a freight train. He looked at Howard, then at Diane, and finally down at Ashley, who was still hiding behind our mother, not saying a single word to defend him. The absolute reality of his situation washed over him. He finally understood what I had known my entire life. To Howard and Diane, anyone outside of their immediate bloodline was just a tool to be used and discarded. Kendrick realized he was never a part of their family. He was just the designated fall guy. They had eagerly used his fake bank ledgers to steal my apartment. They had used his name to set up a fake business. And now that the walls were closing in, they were perfectly willing to throw him under the bus to protect their golden child. Kendrick let out a low, disgusted breath. He slowly shook his head, the anger draining out of him, replaced by a cold, hard survival instinct. "I am done," he said quietly. "I am completely done with all of you." He turned his back on them and walked straight toward the hallway. "Where do you think you are going?" Howard demanded, his voice echoing in the dark. "We have a court hearing in 2 days. You need to fix this lawyer situation right now." "Fix it yourself," Howard Kendrick called back over his shoulder. "I am packing my bags and getting out of this freezing apartment. Good luck explaining to the judge why you are squatting in the dark." The heavy oak front door slammed shut a few minutes later, shaking the camera lens. I sat back in my hotel chair, a deep, genuine smile spreading across my face. The fragile, toxic alliance had officially shattered. They were no longer a united front. They were just three miserable, freezing people sitting in the dark, waiting for the federal hammer to drop. 2 days later, the heavy wooden doors of courtroom 4B at the Cook County Courthouse swung open. I had arrived 30 minutes early, taking a quiet seat on the wooden bench in the very back of the gallery, simply waiting for my case to be called. I wanted to watch them walk in. 15 minutes before the scheduled hearing, my family finally made their grand entrance. It took an incredible amount of professional discipline for me to keep my face completely blank and not laugh out loud at the sight of them. Living for 48 hours in a freezing dark apartment without running water or a working shower had completely stripped them of their polished upper-middle-class veneer. Howard was wearing a navy suit that looked like he had slept in it on a hard floor, his collar wrinkled and his striped tie slightly askew. Diane had clearly been forced to apply her makeup in the dark or in a poorly lit public restroom mirror down the street. Her foundation was patchy, her lipstick was uneven, and her hair completely lacked its usual expensive salon blowout. Ashley looked the worst of all. Without Kendrick there to hide behind, and without access to her luxury beauty products and hot styling tools, she looked incredibly small, exhausted, and deeply defensive. Trailing reluctantly behind them, looking like he would rather be absolutely anywhere else on earth, was a young, severely overworked public legal advocate. The court had scrambled to assign him to my parents after Richard Vance submitted his emergency withdrawal. The young lawyer carried a cheap, battered canvas briefcase overflowing with messy, disorganized files. He kept aggressively rubbing his temples as my father continuously whispered harsh, demanding instructions into his ear. The poor guy probably had 50 other eviction cases piled on his desk that morning. He clearly did not have the time, the budget, or the specialized resources to properly vet my father's forged financial documents. He was just a warm body filling a required legal seat. Despite looking like they had just survived a minor shipwreck, Howard and Diane still carried themselves with that unbearable, toxic arrogance. They marched down the center aisle of the courtroom with their chins tilted up, completely ignoring the sympathetic glances from the other people waiting in the gallery. They pushed through the swinging wooden gate and took their seats at the plaintiff table. Howard leaned back in his wooden chair, adjusting his wrinkled jacket, looking incredibly smug. He truly believed that simply showing up looking distressed and playing the victim would be enough. He thought his forged bank ledgers and the fake power of attorney were still silver bullets that would guarantee his victory. I waited until the bailiff loudly announced our specific civil docket number before making my move. I stood up from the back bench and walked slowly down the center aisle. I did not look disheveled. I was wearing an immaculate, custom-tailored charcoal gray power suit. My hair was pulled back into a sharp, flawless twist. My leather heels clicked with measured, terrifying precision against the polished linoleum floor. I was not carrying a messy folder of loose papers. I was pulling a heavy, reinforced leather rolling briefcase behind me. It was packed with certified financial audits, federal property deeds, and highly classified surveillance transcripts. I bypassed the gallery, pushed through the swinging gate, and took my seat at the defense table. I sat completely alone. I did not need a defense attorney to speak for me today. In cases of complex forensic financial fraud, the raw data speaks perfectly for itself. The tension in the courtroom was immediately suffocating. The air felt thick, heavy, and dangerously combustible. I could literally feel my parents burning holes into the side of my head with their intense glaring. Diane let out a loud theatrical sigh, trying to draw the attention of the court staff to her supposed maternal distress. Ashley kept shifting uncomfortably in her wooden chair, casting nervous, terrified glances at my massive leather briefcase. She knew Kendrick had abandoned them. She knew the fraudulent Porsche loan had been exposed. She was absolutely terrified of what else I had brought with me into this room. The young legal advocate sitting next to my father glanced over at me, his eyes dropping to my rolling briefcase. I saw him swallow hard, the color draining slightly from his face. He leaned over and whispered something to Howard, pointing a pen discreetly at my table. My father just scowled, swatting the young man's hand away and muttering something highly dismissive. Howard was completely blind to the reality of the situation. He was marching directly into a financial slaughterhouse, fully convinced he was the butcher. A heavy, demanding silence fell over the room as the thick wooden door behind the bench swung open. The bailiff ordered everyone to rise. The judge stepped up to the bench, adjusted her reading glasses, opened the thick file containing my father's ridiculous claims, and looked down at the two tables. The final battle had officially begun. The Honorable Judge Martinez, a sharp-featured woman with decades of experience on the civil bench, folded her hands over the thick case file and looked down at the two tables. She called the court to order and immediately addressed the plaintiff's side, asking their legal counsel to state their names for the record and present the foundation of their emergency motion. The young public advocate stood up nervously, his cheap suit hanging loosely from his shoulders. He cleared his throat and began shuffling through his chaotic pile of disorganized papers, stammering as he tried to find his opening statement. Before the poor lawyer could even complete a full sentence, my father violently shoved his chair back. Howard stood up, completely bypassing his assigned legal representation, and puffed out his chest. He was going to handle this himself. He truly believed his natural charisma and his status as a wronged patriarch would easily manipulate the courtroom. "Your Honor," Howard began, his voice dripping with a sickening, rehearsed sorrow. "I apologize for my lack of professional legal counsel today. My previous attorney had a family emergency. But the truth does not need an expensive lawyer to be understood. My wife and I are standing before you as victims of our own misplaced parental trust." He gestured dramatically toward me, his face twisting into an expression of profound betrayal. "For years, we entrusted our eldest daughter, Naomi, with our life savings. We worked our fingers to the bone, living a modest life so we could build a retirement fund. We gave her over $600,000 to invest for us because she is a professional auditor. We thought our money was safe. Instead, she systematically drained our accounts, completely impoverishing us, and used our stolen money to purchase a $2.5 million luxury penthouse for herself." My mother Diane let out a loud theatrical sob from the table. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she performed the role of the devastated, destitute mother perfectly. Ashley patted her back, glaring at me with a look of intense, rehearsed disgust. Howard reached into his wrinkled jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, stapled stack of papers. He handed them to the bailiff, who walked them up to the judge's bench. When confronted with her crimes, my father continued, letting a convincing tremor enter his voice. Naomi finally felt a shred of guilt. 3 weeks ago, she willingly signed a legal power of attorney, granting me full control over her real estate assets so we could sell the penthouse and recoup our stolen retirement funds. She also signed a deed transfer acknowledging our rightful ownership. But then, Your Honor, her greed completely took over again. She locked us out, froze our access, and refused to leave. We had no choice but to file for an emergency eviction to secure the only asset we have left in this world. Judge Martinez took the documents from the bailiff. The courtroom was dead silent except for my mother's continuous fake sniffling. The judge spent a long, agonizing minute reading through the papers. To an untrained eye, they looked completely flawless. The forged signature at the bottom of the power of attorney was a genuinely impressive imitation of my handwriting. The fake property deed had official-looking notary stamps undoubtedly provided by Richard Vance before he realized he was walking into a federal trap and abandoned them. The judge slowly lowered the paperwork and peered over her reading glasses directly at me. Her expression was stern and deeply unamused. In family disputes, judges are accustomed to seeing adult children throw massive tantrums when their financial abuse is exposed. She fully expected me to burst into tears to scream that my parents were lying, or to frantically claim that the signature on the documents was forged. She was waiting for the emotional outburst that would confirm my guilt. Miss Naomi, Judge Martinez said, her voice echoing with heavy authority. I see you do not have legal counsel present today. You are representing yourself against very severe allegations of elder financial abuse. Your father has presented a signed power of attorney and a deed of transfer. Do you have a response to these claims before I rule on the permanent eviction order? I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not even look at my father. I stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my charcoal gray blazer. I looked directly into the judge's eyes, my face completely composed, radiating the cold, absolute certainty of a predator that had just cornered its prey. Yes, Your Honor, I replied, my voice smooth, level, and perfectly audible in the quiet room. My father has just told you a highly compelling and emotional story. He has also presented documents that appear on their surface to be legally binding. However, there is a catastrophic structural flaw in his entire narrative. I reached down and unlatched the heavy brass locks of my rolling leather briefcase. The sharp clicks echoed loudly. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, meticulously organized binder. I placed it on the defense table and slid it firmly across the polished wood toward the bailiff. I am not going to argue about whether or not that is my signature on his documents, Your Honor, I stated clearly, watching my father's smug smile falter for the very first time. I am simply going to prove to this court that the documents he just handed you are mathematically, physically, and legally impossible. The bailiff placed the heavy leather binder directly in front of Judge Martinez. I remained standing at the defense table. Your Honor, I said calmly, please direct your attention to tab A in the binder. What you are looking at is the Certified International Corporate Charter and the recorded property deed for Penthouse 4. My father claims I purchased that apartment using his retirement funds. But as the verified public records show, I am not the legal owner of that property. I never have been. Judge Martinez flipped to the first tab. The property was purchased entirely in cash 3 years ago by an entity known as Titan Trust, LLC. I continued, keeping my voice steady. Titan Trust is a sovereign wealth preservation vehicle registered in the Cayman Islands. I am simply an employee of the firm that manages the domestic assets for that trust. My residence in that penthouse was a corporate housing benefit tied to my employment contract, not a personal real estate acquisition. My father slammed his hands down on the plaintiff table. That is a lie, Howard shouted, his face turning a dark red. She is trying to hide our money behind shell companies. Do not listen to her, Judge. She signed the power of attorney right in front of me. Judge Martinez slammed her wooden gavel down. Sit down and remain silent. Mr. Howard, the judge ordered, her voice vibrating with authority. If you interrupt this court one more time, I will have the bailiff hold you in contempt. Howard slowly sank back into his wooden chair, his chest heaving, his arrogant facade showing its first massive cracks. Diane gripped his arm tightly, looking terrified. The young public defender sitting next to them looked like he was about to be sick. He stared at my binder, realizing he was completely blind to the facts. Judge Martinez looked back up at me. Miss Naomi, she said carefully, if this property is owned by a foreign registered corporate trust, then the power of attorney your father presented is completely invalid. You cannot legally sign away property you do not personally own. That is exactly correct, Your Honor, I replied. Which brings me to the second, much more severe issue. By presenting a forged document to the local police department 2 days ago, my family did not just orchestrate an illegal eviction. They used a locksmith to violently breach the front door of a property exclusively owned by an international corporate entity. I paused, letting the sheer weight of my words settle over the room. Under federal law, I stated clearly breaking into a commercially owned property held by a foreign trust crosses the threshold from a local civil dispute into federal trespassing and commercial burglary. The FBI retains immediate jurisdiction over crimes involving international corporate assets. My parents did not just break into my home. They broke into a sovereign corporate holding. Ashley let out a terrified gasp from the plaintiff table. She covered her mouth with trembling hands, her eyes darting toward the heavy wooden doors as if expecting federal agents to burst through them. Diane looked completely lost, her fake tears replaced by a very real suffocating panic. But that is not all, Your Honor. I continued, pressing my advantage without a single ounce of mercy. Please turn to tab B. My father filed an emergency ex parte motion to freeze my personal bank accounts. He did this by submitting bank ledgers showing massive cash transfers. As a senior forensic auditor, I ran a digital trace on those documents. Tab B contains the metadata analysis proving those ledgers were entirely fabricated using a commercial PDF editor. The public defender shot out of his chair, his face pale. Your Honor, he stammered loudly, holding his hands up in surrender. I had absolutely no prior knowledge of any fabricated evidence. I was assigned this case 2 hours ago. I know you were not involved, I said, turning back to the bench. But the man who created those fake ledgers was my brother-in-law, Kendrick. He transmitted those forged financial documents across state lines using an internet server to reach my father's previous attorney. Under the United States Code, the electronic transmission of fabricated financial documents to defraud an individual constitutes federal wire fraud. The judge slowly took off her reading glasses. The entire dynamic of the courtroom had completely flipped. My family had walked in believing they were the hunters armed with fake papers and unearned arrogance. In less than 5 minutes, I had systematically stripped away their disguise and exposed them to federal criminal liability. They sat perfectly still, completely paralyzed by the realization that their petty family theft had just triggered an unstoppable legal avalanche. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. I could hear the faint rhythmic ticking of the wall clock echoing above the judge's bench. Judge Martinez stared at me, her reading glasses held loosely in her hand, completely absorbing the sheer magnitude of the federal crimes I had just outlined. At the plaintiff table, the young public defender slowly, deliberately pushed his chair a few inches away from my father. It was a subtle physical withdrawal, a lawyer instinctively distancing himself from a client who had just become legally radioactive. My father sat paralyzed, his chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked breaths. The arrogant patriarch who had confidently demanded my eviction just minutes ago was entirely gone, replaced by a terrified old man realizing he had walked directly into a trap. But I was not finished. The first 2 strikes had destroyed their legal standing and exposed their immediate crimes. Now it was time to obliterate their entire moral foundation and public reputation. I did not give them a single second to recover or formulate a new lie. Your Honor, I said, keeping my tone perfectly conversational, as if I were simply reviewing a quarterly earnings report. My parents have sat before you today and wept over their supposed lost retirement funds. They claimed I systematically drained $600,000 of their hard-earned savings to fund my own lifestyle. Since they formally accused me of financial embezzlement in a court of law, I felt it was only appropriate to conduct a comprehensive forensic audit of their actual financial history to locate these missing funds. I gestured toward the heavy leather binder resting in front of the judge. Please turn to tab C, Your Honor. Judge Martinez slipped her glasses back onto her face and flipped to the 3rd section of the binder. What you are looking at is a certified 5-year retrospective audit of my parents' joint checking and savings accounts, I explained, pacing slowly behind the defense table. I cross-referenced their declared tax returns with their actual bank deposits. Over the last 5 years, my parents did indeed amass a small fortune of roughly $600,000. However, that money did not come from their modest salaries. It did not come from careful investments or frugal living. My father suddenly slammed both hands onto the table, half rising from his chair. Stop talking, he yelled, his voice cracking with genuine, unadulterated terror. He looked wildly at the judge. Do not look at those papers. She has no right to dig into my personal finances. This is a violation of my privacy. Judge Martinez did not even look up from the binder. She simply raised her left hand, pointing a single warning finger at Howard. "Sit down and close your mouth, Mr. Howard, or you will spend the rest of this week in a holding cell," she ordered coldly. She turned her eyes back to the financial ledgers, her brow furrowing deeply as she traced the columns of numbers. "Go on, Miss Naomi. Where exactly did this money come from?" I locked eyes with my father, watching the remaining color completely drain from his face. For the past decade, my father has served as the volunteer treasurer for the Grace Fellowship Church Community Outreach Program, I stated clearly. My mother served as the lead coordinator for their annual charity drives, specifically handling cash donations intended for the local food bank and the Children's Hospital Fund. I watched my mother physically shrink in her chair, bringing her trembling hands up to cover her mouth. "If you look at page 4 of that section," I continued, my voice echoing in the dead silent room, "you will see the complete transaction logs. Every single time the church held a major fundraising event, there was a corresponding identical cash deposit made into my parents' personal accounts exactly 48 hours later. They created dummy invoices for fake catering services and phantom event rentals, submitting them to the church board for reimbursement. They were systematically skimming donations meant for sick children and impoverished families, funneling the money directly into their own pockets." Judge Martinez physically recoiled her jaw, literally dropping slightly as she read the irrefutable evidence in front of her. She looked at the fake invoices I had pulled from the church records, comparing them to the corresponding bank deposit slips I had obtained through my audit. The paper trail was flawless, undeniable, and utterly damning. "They did not have a retirement fund, Your Honor," I said, delivering the final devastating blow. "They had a slush fund built entirely on stolen charity money. The reason they panicked and tried to steal my apartment is because the church board recently announced an independent review of their finances. My parents knew their embezzlement was about to be exposed, and they needed a massive liquid asset to sell so they could pay the money back before the church called the police. They tried to frame me for their own impending financial collapse." Diane let out a sharp, genuine wail, burying her face in her arms on the table. She was not acting anymore. The sheer crushing weight of public ruin had finally hit her. Howard slumped back in his chair, staring blankly at the wall, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly. They had walked into the courtroom demanding sympathy and a free penthouse. Instead, they had just been unmasked as the lowest form of thieves, stealing from a charity plate to fund their own delusions of grandeur. The devastating silence in the courtroom hung in the air like a thick fog. My parents were completely paralyzed by the exposure of their charity embezzlement, their arrogant facades shattered into a million irreparable pieces. But I was not finished. The architect of the eviction, my father, had been neutralized. Now it was time to address the primary beneficiary of this entire fraudulent scheme. I turned my gaze away from my broken parents and locked eyes directly with my sister. Ashley physically recoiled, pressing her back hard against the wooden chair. Without Kendrick there to shield her, and with our parents drowning in their own criminal exposure, she looked entirely alone and absolutely terrified. "Your Honor," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room, "I have one final section for your review. Please turn to tab D in the binder." Judge Martinez, who was still staring in disgust at my parents' fake church invoices, took a slow, deep breath and flipped to the next section. "When my family illegally occupied my apartment," I explained calmly, "my brother-in-law Kendrick immediately used my residential address to register a commercial LLC named Apex Wealth Management. He did this to create a fake front for an unlicensed investment brokerage." Included in tab D is a certified transcript of an audio recording captured by my smart home security system, where Kendrick explicitly orders a subordinate to push offshore wires through this fake entity. He is currently fleeing the city because he knows his fraudulent commercial loans are about to default. The young public defender dropped his pen on the table. It rolled off the edge and hit the floor with a loud clatter, but nobody moved to pick it up. The lawyer simply put his head in his hands, completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of felonies unfolding in a simple civil eviction hearing. However, I continued, taking a step closer to the plaintiff table. Kendrick was not the only one utilizing that shell company. My sister Ashley runs a supposed life coaching business. For years, she has bragged about her massive monthly revenue. When I audited the newly formed Apex Wealth Management accounts, I found a direct merchant link to Ashley's personal coaching website. Ashley jumped up from her chair. "Shut up," she screamed, her voice cracking with pure panic. "She is making this up, Judge. She hates me. She has always been jealous of me." Judge Martinez slammed her gavel down so hard the sound cracked like a whip. "Sit down instantly," the judge roared, her patience completely exhausted. "If you speak out of turn again, I will have the bailiff physically restrain you." Ashley collapsed back into her chair, sobbing violently, her chest heaving. I did not even blink. I directed the judge back to the paperwork. "If you look at page 12 of that section, Your Honor, you will see the transaction logs from Ashley's coaching website over the last 72 hours. Since moving into my apartment, she processed over 40 separate transactions, each for exactly $2,000, billing them as premium life coaching consultations. But I ran a forensic trace on the origin of those payments. The credit cards used for those transactions do not belong to legitimate clients. They belong to victims of a recent massive data breach at a regional healthcare provider." The judge traced the highlighted columns with her pen, her eyes widening as the undeniable pattern emerged. "Ashley purchased a batch of stolen credit card numbers on the internet." I stated, my voice echoing with absolute authority. "She ran those stolen cards through her own fake business portal, using Kendrick's new shell company as the payment processor to wash the funds. She was desperately trying to launder enough stolen money to stop the impending repossession of her luxury vehicle. She did not just steal my home to live a glamorous lifestyle. She stole my home to establish a physical base of operations for a highly illegal credit card laundering syndicate." It was Kendrick. Ashley suddenly shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at the empty air where her husband should have been. "It was his idea. He bought the card numbers. He told me to run them through the site so we could pay the bank. He forced me to do it." By screaming her defense, she had just submitted a full, unprompted verbal confession to federal money laundering in an open courtroom right in front of a sitting judge. The absolute stupidity of her outburst was staggering. Judge Martinez slowly closed the heavy leather binder. She took off her reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose, letting out a long, exhausted sigh. She looked at the plaintiff table, her expression shifting from professional detachment to utter, profound disgust. She had seen messy family disputes before, but she had never witnessed an entire family unit systematically expose themselves as a coordinated criminal enterprise within a span of 15 minutes. The civil portion of this dispute was completely over. The criminal destruction was about to begin. Judge Martinez did not waste a single breath responding to Ashley. The judge looked past the crying woman and locked eyes with the armed bailiff standing near the heavy wooden doors. "Secure this courtroom immediately," Judge Martinez commanded, her voice slicing through the frantic sobbing at the plaintiff table. "Nobody leaves this room." The court reporter's fingers flew across her stenograph machine, capturing every single incriminating word. The judge picked up the heavy black telephone receiver resting on her bench and pressed a direct extension. "This is Judge Martinez in courtroom 4B, she said sharply into the receiver. "I need the duty officer for the federal prosecutor downstairs, and I need agents from the FBI Financial Crimes Division up here right now. I have a plaintiff who just submitted a voluntary unprompted verbal confession to federal money laundering and wire fraud on the official court record. We are no longer conducting a civil eviction hearing. This is now an active federal crime scene." My father buried his face in his trembling hands, letting out a sound that was half gasp and half sob. He finally understood that he was not just losing a malicious lawsuit. He was going to lose his freedom, his reputation, and his entire way of life. But before the bailiff could even step forward to lock the main doors, they burst open violently. Standing in the threshold, breathing heavily, and looking completely deranged, was Kendrick. He had not fled the city just yet. He had lingered in the hallway, likely hoping to salvage whatever legal standing he had left, or to see if my parents could somehow win the apartment for him to hide in. He had been standing just outside the heavy doors, and heard his wife scream his name, falsely accusing him of buying stolen credit card numbers. Kendrick did not care about the judge, the armed bailiffs, or courtroom decorum. He stormed down the center aisle of the gallery, his face twisted in absolute, uncontrollable fury. "You lying, manipulative fraud!" Kendrick roared, pointing a shaking finger directly at Ashley. "I never touched those credit cards. I did not even know what you were doing until I saw the ledgers this morning. You ruined my legitimate business. You completely ruined my credit score. And now you are trying to hand me over to the federal government to save your own pathetic skin. I am done protecting you. I am filing for divorce the second I walk out of this building. I want absolutely nothing to do with you or your psychotic thieving family ever again." Ashley shrieked, trying to stand up and reach across the table for him, but the young public defender quickly pulled his chair away, wanting absolutely no part of the physical altercation or the criminal exposure. Kendrick spat a final curse at her, backing away toward the gallery benches, just as the bailiff stepped between them. My mother, seeing the entire situation completely spiraling beyond any hope of her usual manipulation, deployed her final desperate weapon. Diane let out a loud theatrical gasp that echoed off the high ceilings. She clutched her chest with both hands, her eyes rolling back into her head as she threw herself dramatically off her wooden chair. She hit the polished floor with a heavy thud, groaning and thrashing her legs as if experiencing a massive cardiac event. Howard dropped to his knees next to her, screaming for someone to call an ambulance and begging the judge to show some mercy. For my entire life, that exact performance had forced everyone around Diane to drop whatever they were doing and cater to her immediate needs. She had used fake illnesses to ruin my birthdays, my graduations, and my career milestones. But today, in a room governed by hard facts and absolute federal law, her theatrics were utterly useless. The bailiffs did not rush to her aid. They simply stood their ground, blocking the exits. Judge Martinez peered over the tall wooden bench, looking down at my mother writhing on the floor with an expression of profound boredom. "Get up, Mrs. Howard," the judge ordered coldly. "We have paramedics in the building who can check your vitals, but a panic attack will not stop the federal agents from placing you in handcuffs when they walk through those doors in 5 minutes." I remained seated at the defense table. I did not flinch when Kendrick screamed his lungs out. I did not move a single muscle when my mother threw herself onto the floor and wailed. I slowly reached out and closed the heavy leather binder, the sharp click of the brass locks echoing softly over the absolute chaos in the room. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly on the table, my posture straight. I watched the people who had terrorized me, belittled me, and tried to steal everything I had built, completely destroy themselves. They were screaming, crying, and turning on each other like trapped animals. The trap had sprung flawlessly, and the silence in my own mind was beautiful. Exactly 1 week after the courtroom collapse, the absolute reality of their actions finally arrived at their front doors. It was a crisp, clear Tuesday morning, the kind of suburban morning where neighbors water their lawns and walk their expensive dogs. My parents had retreated to their sprawling, manicured colonial house in the suburbs, completely avoiding all phone calls and isolating themselves from the community. They were likely sitting in their pristine kitchen, sipping coffee, and frantically trying to figure out a way to spin their impending federal indictments into a story where they were still the victims. They did not hear the engines of the unmarked vehicles until they were already parked directly in their driveway. 3 heavy black federal SUVs pulled up onto the perfectly edged grass, completely blocking the driveway. The doors opened in perfect synchronization, and a team of agents wearing dark windbreakers with FBI printed in bold yellow letters on the back stepped out. They moved with absolute terrifying efficiency. There was no polite knock. There was no friendly request to come inside. A senior agent approached the heavy oak front door and pounded his fist against it so hard the sound echoed down the entire quiet street. "Howard Diane!" The agent shouted, his voice carrying an unmistakable tone of absolute legal authority. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant. Open the door immediately." Inside, I can only imagine the sheer suffocating panic that must have seized my parents. The neighbors, drawn by the commotion, began stepping out of their houses, holding their coffee mugs and watching in stunned silence as the wealthy, respectable couple they had known for years was completely exposed. My father opened the door, his face pale and slack. He tried to puff out his chest, tried to muster a shred of his old arrogance, but the senior agent completely ignored his posturing. He thrust a thick stack of federal warrants into Howard's chest, forcefully pushing his way past him into the marble foyer. "Secure the premises," the lead agent commanded to his team. "We are seizing all electronic devices, all financial ledgers, and all physical assets purchased within the last 5 years. Everything goes into evidence." Diane came rushing down the carpeted stairs, clutching her silk robe tightly around her neck. She let out a sharp, terrified scream as agents began systematically moving through her perfectly decorated home. They did not care about her expensive taste. They opened her custom mahogany cabinets, pulling out crystal decanters and designer plates. They walked into her walk-in closet and began hauling out rows of luxury handbags and imported shoes. Every single item she had purchased using the stolen church donations was actively being confiscated to pay back the charity. "You cannot do this," my father stammered weakly, watching an agent carry out his brand new flat-screen television. "We are respectable people. We made a mistake." The senior agent stopped, turning to look at Howard with a cold, unforgiving stare. "You are not respectable people, sir," the agent replied sharply. "You embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars meant for sick children. You are federal criminals. If you say another word to me, I will place you in handcuffs right now instead of waiting for your official arraignment on Friday." Howard slumped against the wall, utterly defeated. Diane collapsed onto the bottom step of the staircase, weeping hysterically, but there was no one left to manipulate. The agents moved around her like she was a piece of furniture, actively stripping away the entire fake life she had built. Simultaneously, 30 miles away in the downtown financial district, Kendrick was experiencing his own personal nightmare. Despite publicly demanding a divorce and trying to distance himself from Ashley, the federal government does not simply forget about commercial mortgage fraud and unlicensed brokerage operations. Kendrick was sitting at his rented desk in a sleek, glass-walled office building, desperately trying to call the predatory lenders to buy himself more time on the massive loan. He was wearing his sharpest suit, still trying to project the image of a highly successful investment banker. The glass doors of his office swung open. Two federal agents, accompanied by local police officers, walked straight toward his desk. Kendrick stood up quickly, raising his hands, trying to look cooperative. "Gentlemen," he said smoothly, a nervous sweat breaking out on his forehead. "There has been a massive misunderstanding. I was manipulated by my wife's family. I am completely willing to testify against them." The lead agent did not even slow down. He pulled a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "Save it for the prosecutor, Kendrick," the agent said, grabbing Kendrick's arm and twisting it sharply behind his back. "You are under arrest for securities fraud, wire fraud, and operating an unlicensed financial institution." The metallic click of the handcuffs echoed loudly in the busy office. His colleagues, the people he had tried so desperately to impress with his fake wealth, watched in absolute shock as Kendrick was forcefully marched out of the building. His expensive suit suddenly looked cheap and ridiculous. He was shoved into the back of a waiting police cruiser, completely stripped of his arrogant facade. The federal hammer had fallen on all of them simultaneously, completely shattering their lives and leaving absolutely nothing behind but the brutal consequences of their own insatiable greed. While my parents were watching their stolen luxury items being carried out by federal agents, and Kendrick was experiencing the cold reality of steel handcuffs, Ashley was waking up completely alone in the freezing dark master bedroom of my penthouse. She had spent the entire week huddled under blankets, ignoring the frantic texts from her husband and the absolute silence from our parents. At exactly 10 in the morning, the heavy oak front door was unlocked from the outside. Ashley emerged from the bedroom, wrapped tightly in my cashmere throw, to find four armed private security contractors standing in the living room alongside the building's property manager and two Chicago police officers. Titan Trust, LLC, had officially reclaimed the asset. The property manager did not offer a single ounce of sympathy. He handed her a formal trespass notice and gave her exactly 10 minutes to gather whatever fit into a single duffel bag. She screamed, demanded her legal rights, and threatened to call her high-powered lawyer. The police officer simply pointed to the door, warning her that she would be physically removed in handcuffs if she did not comply immediately. She was forced to leave behind the racks of designer dresses, the expensive shoes, and the entire physical illusion of her wealth. She was escorted down the service elevator and unceremoniously dumped onto the busy downtown sidewalk, shivering in the crisp autumn air with nothing but a cheap canvas bag. Standing on the concrete, she pulled out her phone, desperately trying to order a premium rideshare to our parents' house. But her payment methods were entirely declined. The predatory lenders Kendrick had used were actively draining her remaining credit limits to cover the defaulted loans. Panicking, she opened her social media accounts, hoping to reach out to her wealthy network of friends for a place to crash. Instead, she was met with an absolute digital slaughter. The local news had just broken the story of the massive federal raid on Grace Fellowship Church's former treasurer, complete with footage of my parents being loaded into unmarked vehicles. Simultaneously, an online finance blog had published a scathing article detailing Kendrick's public arrest for operating a fraudulent brokerage. Internet sleuths had immediately connected the dots. They flooded Ashley's prestigious life coaching page with thousands of vicious comments. Former followers mocked her fake inspirational quotes and her performative wealth. But it got much worse. The victims of the credit card theft had recognized the fraudulent charges originating from her business portal. They were actively organizing a massive class action lawsuit in her comments section. Her personal brand was not just dead, it was an active digital crime scene. Ashley frantically tried to delete the comments, but her phone buzzed with an incoming email. Her web hosting platform had suspended her website entirely for violating terms of service regarding illegal financial transactions. She was completely erased from the internet. With no access to her bank accounts, her husband in federal custody, and her parents' home designated as an active crime scene, Ashley had absolutely nowhere to go. She walked 3 miles in expensive, painful heels to a sketchy pawn shop, trading her diamond engagement ring for a tiny fraction of its value just to get raw cash. She took a public bus to the far outskirts of the city, checking into a miserable, rundown motel by the highway. The golden child who had spent her entire life demanding 5-star treatment and looking down on anyone who flew economy was now sitting on a stained, sagging mattress in a room that smelled of stale smoke and bleach. She stared at the peeling wallpaper, the absolute weight of her $90,000 credit card debt, and impending federal legal charges crushing the breath out of her lungs. She had no real skills, no actual degree, no friends who would ever associate with her again, and a husband who was actively preparing to testify against her to save himself. As the sun set, plunging the cheap motel room into a depressing, flickering neon glow from the parking lot sign outside, Ashley reached the absolute bottom of her despair. She scrolled through her empty contacts list. There was only one person left in the entire world who actually had the financial power and the legal knowledge to save her from federal prison. She hesitated, her toxic pride fighting a losing battle against her sheer terror. Her fingers trembled violently as she pulled up my contact information. The sister she had mocked, bullied, and tried to leave homeless just days ago was now her only lifeline. She pressed the call button, bringing the phone to her ear, listening to the dial tone ring in the quiet, miserable room, praying that I would answer. I was sitting on the pristine white cashmere sofa in my freshly cleaned penthouse when my phone began to vibrate against the glass coffee table. The building management had fully restored the utilities the exact moment the police cleared the trespassers from the premises, and a professional corporate cleaning crew had spent 2 entire days erasing every physical trace of my family from my home. The wine stains were gone, the locks were upgraded to biometric scanners, and the quiet, luxurious peace had finally returned. I picked up the phone and looked at the glowing screen. It was Ashley. I could have easily sent the call straight to voicemail, but I wanted to hear the sound of absolute defeat. I swiped the screen and brought the phone to my ear, saying absolutely nothing. The line was completely silent for a heavy second before a jagged, wet sob echoed through the speaker. "Naomi, please do not hang up," Ashley cried, her voice completely devoid of its usual arrogant, high-pitched confidence. It sounded raspy, terrified, and utterly broken. "I am so sorry. I am so sorry for everything." I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, letting her cry into the silence. When I did not respond to her tears, she launched into a frantic, desperate monologue. "They took everything from me, Naomi. The armed security guards threw me out onto the street like garbage. Kendrick is in federal custody, and the banks have completely frozen my accounts. I had to pawn my engagement ring just to get a room. I am sitting in a disgusting motel off the highway, and I do not even have enough money to buy food for tomorrow." I listened patiently as she seamlessly shifted from playing the victim to utilizing her classic toxic manipulation tactics. "You have to help me," she begged, her voice rising in a frantic pitch. "We are sisters. We are family. I know we have had our differences in the past, but blood is thicker than water. You are the only one who has the money and the connections to hire a good federal defense attorney. I will pay you back every single cent, I promise, on my life. Kendrick manipulated me into doing all those terrible things with the business. Mom and Dad poisoned me against you since we were kids. It was not my fault. Please, Naomi, do not let me go to a federal prison. I will not survive in there." The sheer audacity of her excuses was almost impressive, even at absolute rock bottom facing severe federal indictments. My sister was completely incapable of taking personal accountability. She was still trying to play the innocent golden child, desperately hoping I would fall back into my old role as the family punching bag and financial savior. I let her finish her frantic pleading, allowing the dead silence to stretch out on the line until I could hear her ragged, panicked breathing. "Ashley," I finally said, my voice completely flat and entirely devoid of any sisterly warmth. "You did not care about family when you stood in my private hallway and laughed while a locksmith destroyed my home. You did not care about blood when you ran stolen credit cards through a fake business, actively hoping I would take the fall for your federal crimes so you could keep driving a luxury car." I paused, ensuring my next words would be permanently burned into her memory for the rest of her miserable life. "You were blood until you drilled through my front door. Enjoy reality." I pulled the phone away from my ear, cutting off her sudden hysterical scream, and pressed the red end call button. I immediately went into my contacts menu, selected her profile, and permanently blocked the number. I did the exact same thing for my father and my mother. The emotional dead weight I had been carrying for 33 years was finally permanently severed. I breathed in the quiet, peaceful air of my living room, feeling completely liberated. Before I could even set the phone back down on the coffee table, it vibrated again. I glanced at the caller identification and raised a surprised eyebrow. It was not the human resources director this time. It was the personal cellular number of the global chief executive officer of my firm. I answered the call with my standard, crisp, professional greeting. "Naomi, the CEO," began, his tone remarkably deferential and laced with genuine urgency. "I am calling you personally to offer my deepest, most sincere apologies on behalf of the entire executive board. The federal raid on your parents made the local news cycle this morning. The authorities released a preliminary statement confirming they were running an embezzlement ring, completely validating every single piece of evidence you presented to the compliance committee. We realize now that you were the victim of a malicious, coordinated smear campaign." I leaned back into the soft cushions of my sofa, quietly enjoying the sound of a billionaire actively groveling. "The HR director who suspended you has been formally reprimanded," he continued quickly, desperate to retain my talent. "We want you back in the office immediately. In fact, the board just held an emergency vote this morning. We are offering you the position of senior partner in the Global Forensics Division effective today. It comes with a massive promotion, a corner office, full back pay for your time on leave, and a public company-wide apology issued directly from my office. We need your brilliant mind back on our team, Naomi. Name your terms. I smiled, the sheer power of the moment settling over me like a heavy, comforting blanket. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water before responding. My terms are simple, I told the CEO, my voice ringing with absolute unshakable confidence. I want a 20% increase in my equity share, complete autonomy over my divisional case selections, and a dedicated team of 5 junior analysts handpicked entirely by me. Furthermore, the firm will cover the legal fees I incurred while dealing with my family's fraudulent injunctions. The billionaire did not hesitate for a single second. He agreed to every single condition before I even finished the sentence. I hung up the phone, walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows, and looked out over the glittering city of Chicago. The storm was finally over, and I had emerged completely victorious. 6 months later, the crisp, bitter autumn air had surrendered to a warm, vibrant spring. My professional life had reached heights I had never even dreamed of. As a senior partner, I now commanded an entire division dismantling corporate fraud with a team of brilliant minds who respected my leadership. But my personal life was where the true transformation had occurred. My penthouse was completely unrecognizable from the dark, freezing concrete box my toxic relatives had briefly turned it into. Tonight, it was alive. The space glowed with warm, ambient lighting. Soft jazz played from the integrated smart speakers, mingling perfectly with the bright sounds of genuine laughter and the clinking of crystal glasses. The air smelled of roasted garlic, fresh herbs, and an incredibly expensive vintage red wine. I was hosting a dinner party, but this was not a gathering of blood relatives bound by obligation and resentment. I was surrounded by my chosen family. I stood near the edge of the living room, simply watching the beautiful scene unfold. My mentor David, who had guided me through the early, grueling days of my career, was standing by the marble kitchen island, telling a hilarious story to my lead junior analyst. The human resources director, who had personally fought to fast-track my back pay and secure my new corner office, was pouring champagne for my closest friends from college. There was no tension in the room. There were no snide remarks, no jealous whispers, and absolutely no one expecting me to sacrifice my own stability to fund their mistakes. These people respected my boundaries. They celebrated my victories because they were genuinely happy for me, not because they were looking for a way to steal my trophy. They loved me for who I was, not for what I could provide. I slipped away from the lively conversation and stepped out onto the glass-walled balcony. The warm evening breeze wrapped around me, carrying the distant, energetic hum of the city below. I leaned against the smooth metal railing, swirling the champagne in my crystal glass, and let myself fully absorb the profound peace of my new reality. The federal justice system moves slowly, but it moves with absolute crushing certainty. My parents had eventually pleaded guilty to multiple counts of wire fraud and embezzlement to avoid a lengthy, humiliating public trial. They were currently residing in a low-security federal facility, their suburban home sold at auction, to repay the church charity they had so eagerly robbed. Kendrick had immediately turned state's evidence, testifying against Ashley to reduce his own sentence, but he was still facing significant time for his unlicensed brokerage scheme. As for my sister, she had avoided jail time by cooperating with the credit card fraud investigation, but she was now burdened with massive court-ordered restitution. The golden child was currently working double shifts at a suburban retail store, her designer clothes and luxury cars, nothing more than a distant, painful memory. They had tried to completely destroy my life, but in the end, they had only succeeded in permanently removing themselves from it. They had unknowingly handed me the greatest gift of my life: absolute freedom. I looked out at the endless grid of city lights, a profound sense of clarity washing over me. Growing up, I was constantly told that I had to endure the abuse, the manipulation, and the blatant theft simply because we shared the same last name. But I know the truth now. Family isn't blood. Family is a title earned through respect. When toxic people try to burn your house down, you don't cry, you just buy the fire department. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your own peace, or if you are currently building a beautiful chosen family of your own. I want to hear your story in the comments below. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to join our community of survivors who refuse to be victims. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, your boundaries are your ultimate power. Protect them at all costs. The story of Naomi serves as a powerful, unflinching reminder that the concept of family is never an unconditional free pass for toxic behavior. From a young age, society conditions us to believe the old adage that blood is thicker than water. We are constantly fed the narrative that we must endlessly forgive, accommodate, and protect our relatives no matter how deeply they cross our boundaries or betray our trust. However, Naomi's harrowing but ultimately triumphant journey dismantles this harmful myth entirely. The most profound lesson we can extract from her experience is that your self-worth and the life you have painstakingly built must be fiercely protected, even from those who share your DNA. When her parents and sister attempted to strip her of her home, her career, and her sanity, they relied heavily on the arrogant assumption that familial obligation would force her into submission. They expected her to break. Instead, Naomi taught us the incredible power of responding to emotional manipulation with quiet preparation, unshakable boundaries, and cold, hard facts. A shared last name does not excuse emotional abuse, manipulation, or financial exploitation. True family is fundamentally rooted in mutual respect, unwavering trust, and genuine support. When those core pillars are absent, the relationship is merely biological, not familial. Naomi's ability to surgically sever those toxic ties and celebrate her victory, surrounded by a chosen family, illustrates a beautiful truth. Walking away from abusers is never an act of cruelty. It is an act of absolute necessary self-preservation. You do not owe your peace or your success to people who view you only as a resource to be exploited. If you are currently dealing with toxic relationships, please take a moment today to evaluate your boundaries and share your own stories of reclaiming your peace in the comments below.